Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us. Dr. Fadiman, thank you so much for joining us on the Wild Health podcast. For those of you who are listening and may have heard Dr. Fadiman talk at our Brain Optimization Summit recently, you're going to be excited for some follow-up, I'm sure. We talked about his new book, Your Symphony of Selves, which is what we really want to focus on today. But right before we do, I did want to kind of ask a few follow-up questions. So we talked a fair amount about microdosing and psychedelics at the Brain Optimization Summit when we got into non-ordinary states. And I don't necessarily want to talk about where we are right now with those things, because I think a lot of people realize we're kind of in a strange gray area where there are a lot of books written about it in popular culture. A lot of people are using these substances both on a macro scale and a micro scale. But what I want to talk about is just briefly, I would love to just hear about, Dr. Fadiman, when you were doing research on these things in the 60s, before it was kind of shut down in 1970 by Nixon, where we were. And then I would love to just hear your thoughts on kind of where we're going. So that's a lot. So to kind of bring it down, I guess I would like to just start with, when you were doing research in the 60s, what were you finding and what was your really hope for these medicines at that time?
Well, I was working in a little clinic. Um, Basically, we were like a mental health outpatient clinic, except that you had to go through a psychiatrist to get to us. And if you were less mentally well, we turned you down. So it's kind of the opposite of some clinics. But we were giving high doses with guides and with a very nice room, very much what's done today. And what we were finding is when people had a really a transcendent dose, and that's quite high, that's 400 micrograms of LSD usually, and they would then come back into their normal life, their worldview would have changed and they would feel much more able to make changes in their life that they needed to do, often without effort. Alcoholics, for example, and we had a few, would almost all within a week go out and get drunk. And they would come to us and say, "Hey, what happened?" We'd say, "What do you mean, what happened?" They'd say, "I didn't like it at all." And that usually ended their drinking. So this was a very different kind of mental health program, certainly than was available in the 60s, and not too different from what's being done today at Johns Hopkins and NYU and in London, etc. So we're kind of taking those 40 years of no research and redoing some of the better work of the 60s and then going on into new areas. The only main difference is in the 60s, the government was trying to shut it down every way possible. And right now, it looks like the stock market is the hottest place in town to talk about psychedelics. And that's a real change.
Well, I jumped right in assuming people knew your work, but just in case there are a couple people not out there that haven't read it. So the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide is an incredible book about that whole story. And I asked you kind of what you all were doing, but to get even more specific, you were doing research with LSD and macro doses, which you just talked about. But
Right. And also with creativity and problem solving. This is when we use the term problem solving, we mean problems that you as a highly skilled professional scientist, researcher couldn't solve.
mhm. And that,
So we asked people who were stuck at a pretty high level if they would like to come in and take one day with a moderate dose, in this case about 100, the equivalent of 100 micrograms, and with some guidance, be allowed to work on these insolvable problems for a few hours. And it was quite successful. We had like 48 problems and like 44 solutions. And we also knew we had something going when other people in the same laboratory would come to us and say, hey, I don't know what you did with Charlie, but can I sign up for this research? So it was remarkably successful. And it was a totally different use of psychedelics, where you use your rational, scientific, analytic mind and your imaging, your ability to image in ways that you had not been able to do before. So it was really a kind of acceleration of high creativity.
There's
And
some great stories in the book about maybe even Watson and Crick and the double helix with the DNA, a lot of other interesting examples of creative ideas that happened. What about microdosing? Because for a lot of people who have read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, or have read Stealing Fire that talks about CEOs and Navy SEALs, you're the one that's really credited with potentially bringing this to Silicon Valley and a lot of those people who have used this for good. When did that research start? Can you tell us about that?
Well, that started 10 years ago when a friend of mine said Albert Hoffman had told him, Albert Hoffman, the man who synthesized LSD, told him that very low doses could be very useful. And that got my attention because I was Mr. High Dose, and low doses sounded like, it's like if you're used to 151 proof rum and someone says, try a sip of this 3.2 beer, it'll blow your mind. Not interested, okay? But I was curious, and people began to report that microdosing at 10 micrograms seemed to be valuable. And my curiosity and having a lot of friends who shared my curiosity led to a really quite a large research project. And we now have about 3,000 reports from 51 countries. So it's become a world phenomena, probably because it's safe. In a sense, it's dull, meaning there are no psychedelic effects, and it seems to improve a lot of both physical and mental conditions. And that research is now just starting to be done in the conventional way with universities and laboratories, and it's very exciting.
Dr. Fadiman, a lot of your research was around the macrodosing of LSD. As you know, and as you and I have talked about, psilocybin is on the ballot for possibly being used for medical indications in Oregon, coming up just in a couple days. Could you speak a little bit to the differences between psilocybin and LSD, and then also maybe just comment on, if we're talking about making psilocybin legal, should the rest of these be legal as well?
Well, those are two. Let me do the easy question, which is LSD and psilocybin affect the same brain receptors that we've measured, affect all the other receptors that we don't know much about, and have very similar effects if you match the dosage. The major difference is LSD's major effects are 7 to 12 hours. Psilocybin is 4 to 6 hours. What that really means is you can give psilocybin in a medical setting with expensive staff, and you only have one shift. If you go to LSD, it's going to be 2 shifts. And that was actually one of the reasons for the work being done with psilocybin. The difference between LSD and psilocybin really, there are no real measurements. There's a lot of subjective talk in the community that psilocybin is nicer and that LSD is more analytic, but that's pretty subtle. As for the idea that people should be allowed to do things that improve their health, that are among, and I'm now quoting the ex-English drug czar, are among the safest pharmaceuticals we've ever found. That people should be denied that was just an accident of history, bad judgment, and President Nixon. And it's wonderful to see that Oregon will very carefully, and I notice it's supposed to take 2 years to get the regulations instead of a couple of weeks, but it will allow people to get better from conditions that they have trouble with. And we know in the mental health work that SSRIs are at best not very good. And it looks like psilocybin in all the recorded research is more effective for depression more quickly and with less side effects than these other substances.
So
As for decriminalizing in general, just last thing, the idea that plants are illegal. I talk to plants and they all say that's one of the craziest bits of legislation they've ever heard of.
yeah, that's a general consensus among the plants for sure. So, so speaking of that, when it is legalized, because it is being decriminalized and potentially legalized, how do we safeguard against negative outcomes? What I mean by that is Mike and I come from an ER background, and we've seen a large number of Tylenol overdoses and liver failure and bad things. And so we know that anything, no matter how safe it is, once it gets out to a large number, there are going to be issues and problems. And if Tylenol, if we were thinking about legalizing it right now, it would be a much bigger hurdle than legalizing some of these things. But there are going to be bad outcomes. How do we protect against that and not have a similar situation as we had in the late
Well,
60s, early 70s?
in the ER, they should be able to say to someone, "What did you take?" and go from there. And if it's a psychedelic, basically they say, let's make you comfortable, let's give you some water, let's give you maybe someone to hold your hand. They should operate on the principle of the Zendo, which is a harm reduction system that is at Burning Man and major festivals, which has handled cases that would freak out a lot of ER people. And they're not freaked out because they know fundamentally, physiologically, the person is in no danger. And there was a recent report of 3 people. One had taken, I think, 5 times a macro dose, a large dose of LSD. One had taken 50 times, and one had taken several hundred times the dose. Now, the people on the high end, 50 and like a couple of hundred, were out of it in a very, in a very technical way, like not a coma, but basically out of it for several days, and had no residual physical effects. And to everyone's amazement, both of them had some chronic issues, chronic mental health in one case, physical pain in the other. And both of those conditions were alleviated by the enormous overdose. Now, that doesn't mean overdoses are a good idea, but it looks like we're talking about something quite safe, and that people who enter an ER need to be protected from their own paranoia, their own fear, but not physiologically anything that you guys would be worrying about.
I suspect that if we do see decriminalization, we're probably going to see probably an uptick in microdosing as well, as at least with the excitement in the community regarding microdosing. I'm curious if in your research on microdosing, sort of the self-reported surveys that you've done, have people had any reduction in depression symptoms or decreased use in prescription medications for depression?
Well, 2 things. Those are 2 questions. Understand, people that come to our basically our website for information on how to use these safely and effectively. And what we suggest is taking it 1 day on and 2 days off at a very low dose. Most, probably 95% of the depression people are what we would call treatment resistant. I mean, they've had a bunch of SSRIs, they may have had a lot of extraordinary therapies that neither of you would ever recommend, and they're depressed. With that group, about 80% report they're no longer depressed when they microdose for a couple of weeks, sometimes as soon as 1 or 2 doses. Now, what they don't say, "I'm no longer depressed." They say, "I'm back. I'm myself. I have my full kind of emotional set." And not only their negative emotions are being handled better, as is true with SSRIs when they work, but their positive emotions are also improved. So they're not only less sad, they're more glad. And that's separate from what SSRIs do. So we're talking about a really different class of substances with a different class of effects. Now, notice I said depression. I did not say anxiety. Now, people who are depressed often are also anxious for obvious reasons because their life isn't working. But people with pure anxiety, we do microdosing is probably not a very good idea, because for those people, they say, I'm either more aware of my anxiety or I'm more anxious. And that's something that we don't know how to measure. So it's not recommended. And there are a few other fairly rare reasons why one doesn't microdose. But remember, psychedelics themselves at high doses are remarkably safe. Microdoses are that much safer, because and when people have either no reaction or a reaction they find uncomfortable, we just say stop. It's a little bit like if you eat a food at a restaurant and it doesn't agree with you, you just don't eat that food anymore. It's not a major medical crisis.
Dr. Fadiman, your statement, your quote from someone about them being kind of back to themselves reminded me of something that I want to ask you about. It in the emergency room, like I mentioned before, Mike and I have a lot of experience with giving patients ketamine for procedural sedation and for other uses. And I would always try to use that as often as possible, because frequently I would get patients come back from a sedation. And I remember specific patients who had chronic back pain or depression or other issues. And they would tell me, this is the first time I felt like myself in years. So the question that I have with that is, with ketamine being legal and a lot of people are using ketamine now for depression, things like that, how different is that than an LSD or psilocybin? How much more of a need are there for other medications when we already have one that is legal right now?
Well, the research on ketamine is still fairly sketchy, mainly because there's no profit in it. It's not a profitable drug. It's too inexpensive. But what I can tell you is, I was at a meeting of people in another state than California, and it was most of the people there were running ketamine clinics, and every one of them said they really wanted to switch to psilocybin as soon as it was legal, and they were setting up a kind of system and offices and so forth ready for that. So they all would have preferred psilocybin. So that's just not a clinical note, but I guess it's a medical professional note. My understanding is ketamine doesn't seem to have the same transcendent quality as a classic psychedelic, and also the effects don't last as long. Ketamine, say, removes depression, and in the ER, that's fine. They go home, you don't see them. If you're seeing them in a clinic for depression, most of the practitioners will say, we'd like you to sign up for at least 3 sessions over the next couple of months. So the assumption at the clinic level is it won't last, meaning it isn't turning around the underlying problem, it's alleviating the physiological side. That seems to be where we are. And I have friends who swear by ketamine and would probably feel I had not given it a high enough rating in that answer, but it's clearly an in-between drug. And the fact that it's legal is a quirk that I'm sure the people who don't like psychedelics are really sad about, but it's just a quirk in our medical law.
Dr. Fadiman, my next question is a terrible question, but you're the only person I could possibly ask it to. We're at a juncture here in the realm of mind-altering drugs, where, as we've mentioned, ketamine clinics are now all over the place. We're sort of on the precipice of this sort of decriminalization and possibly medical use of psilocybin. Where are we going with this? Where do you suspect society is going to be taking psychedelics and mind-altering drugs in the next 10 years?
Well, hold on, guys. Sorry. Okay. What we're going to have, hopefully, is reminding me how to turn my phone off of my computer, but that's a different set of problems. Actually, it's a very tough question, and I could answer it probably more easily in a week if I knew which way the United States was going. But if I assume a change in government, there'll be a renewed emphasis in mental health. And the idea that we have something that could improve on SSRIs will bring such joy to all the psychiatrists who prescribe these, knowing full well their limitations. So we're going to see an improvement in the capacity to deliver mental health. That's pretty much a given. And that's what you're also seeing in the many stocks and companies that are pouring into what's now called the psychedelic space. That's a term in the venture capital world. What we're going to see culturally is more and more people who take some of the mental health into their own hands, predominantly because a number of these substances are plants and fungus, which grow and can be cultivated. So we're going to see a democratization of the mental health kind of capacity. So it's just as in colonial times, most people, the reason people grew apple trees is they needed something to drink that was safe, and water wasn't, but apple cider, hard and soft, was. And so you basically owned the means of production so that you could take care of your own internal health. And I think that's where we're going. That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is there'll be another round of it's going to be much harder to do the repression and that was done before, because we now know that these substances grow in a lot of places. And there's, for instance, there's over 100 species of psilocybin-bearing mushrooms, and they grow all over the planet. So we're going to see a healing in ways that we were not able to before. That's a very optimistic point of view, and I think one that is pretty easily justified.
As big as the problem of depression and anxiety and just mental maladies we have in society, as clinicians, we're always excited for safe tools, more things that we can use. Until it is legal, though, I'd like to transition and talk really quickly about your book, because this is something that can be applied to everyone right now. Your book, your Symphony of Selves, is a book that a lot of times you'll read a book for enjoyment. You want the stories out of it, or sometimes you read it for self-help. You want to improve yourself or others. This is a book that I really enjoyed, but I really enjoyed not just because it was well written, but because it was very useful to me. And so I've recommended it to a lot of people, and would just love to talk about it. And I guess the first question I would have is, instead of me trying to explain what it's about, I'm sure you would be much better. So even though I've explained it to a lot of people, I've got you on. So tell me what this book is about and how you came to this conclusion.
Title is called Your Symphony of Selves. That suggests two things. One, you have selves, more than one. And two is they would work better if they were like a symphony where all the different instruments support and are aware of each other. We live, that is our assumption, not our assumption, our observation is that we all have selves. And a very simple way of just testing, anyone who's listening can do this test. Have you ever argued with yourself? If you have, who was the other being on that side of the argument? Very, very simple. Have you ever said to someone or to yourself, I don't know what got into me? And has someone ever said to you, that's just not the way you behave, that's not who you are? And you think, no, it isn't the way I am, but I did that. Have you ever noticed the difference between your personality when you've had more to drink than the rest of your personality thought was a good idea, but another part of your personality says, no, I haven't had quite enough, until it falls over? So we're aware that we have selves, and we're aware that we are inconsistent, and we wish that other people were consistent, but they're not. And what we're saying is you actually, this self is consistent, and this self is consistent, and things move you from one to the other. Right now, for instance, we have a problem in this country where a lot of us have friends, and if we say a word meaning Democratic or Republican, they will flip into another self, usually one we don't like, and one that they don't particularly like either, because they will have, we call, lost their temper. They haven't lost their temper, they found their temper, and they can't, and most of them can't control it, but the part that's angry has no interest in being controlled. So we have all these internal divisions. And what this book says in an awful lot of pages is, if that's true, and it is true for you, this reader, knowing that will make your life work better, because you will understand yourself better. You will forgive the parts of yourself that you're mad at. You will also not demand of your spouse and of your children, and even of your dogs and cats, by the way, that they behave consistently, because that isn't the way they are. That's the book, and thank you for asking.
Yeah, when I was reading it, I had an epiphany that I started to realize that so much of the conflict in my life was because I was simply applying the wrong self. I realized I'm a CEO with employees. I'm a physician with patients. I'm a father with 4 children. I'm a husband with a wife. And if any time those different selves got mixed up, that's when, I mean, when I talk to my children like they were my employees, or I talk to my patients like they're my employees, or any of the mixes just didn't work, and it led to conflict. And just being able to have that realization, and to be able to, as I'm pulling into the garage, take the CEO and physician hat off and put the dad and father hat on, was just really profoundly helpful for me. And I never heard it explained like that before.
That's exactly what it is it's helpful. It doesn't change your life, but it made it make sense. And it made it easier for you to make those changes when they're correct. So when you're coming back from the ER, where you're on hyper alert, you're paying attention to every single thing that you can imagine in everyone you're working on. You don't want to do that to your family. And literally, what people have learned to do is they literally, and actually in medical world, you literally take off your scrubs, you take off your costume, you take off your doctorness, and you put on your fatherness. And that's who hopefully drives home and says hello to the kids, rather than, oh, look at the kids, one of them looks like he's having a slight hyper something. Your wife says, hey, you're not a doctor right now, you're a father, relax. So the remarkable thing about the book is it has that epiphany feeling. Most self-help books, and I've written one that I think was terrific, which you can't find very easily. They all say, after you've read this book, you got to do something. They're all like cookbooks. You know, no matter how many cookbooks you read, you have to prepare food. But when you read this book, the reading of it is the doing of it. And that leads to exactly that epiphany of, oh, my life not only is more understandable, but I'm now in better control. I have more capacity for harmony.
The other day, I asked my wife, our daughter had a injured foot, and she was talking to me about it. And in my mind, I was trying to figure out which role I was supposed to play. And I ended up asking her, I said, am I a husband just listening right now? Am I a father, or am I a doctor? Like, I need to know which of these roles, because it's very different answers I'm going to give you right now.
Yeah, and that's the way we are. And being conscious makes it so much easier, right? So it's a way of also you begin to see when you're about to go into a self that isn't going to work for people, that you, before you get there, you can kind of feel that I'm about to lose it. And you can, by knowing that, you can stop. And we actually, it's one of the first things we learn as children, assuming we had parents at all, they said, count to 10. What? Why should I count to 10? I want to punch my brother. And counting to 10, which is a breathing exercise, actually allows you to shift back towards a more centered position. And just as you were told as a child, you'll be less likely to, quote, lose your temper, to become ill-tempered, if you simply take a few breaths. So we have this. From our childhood, we have methods of moving from self to self, and making it conscious just makes it way easier.
Since reading your book, I've been actually practicing that some. When I transition from one self to the next self, I'll do some 4-7-8 breathing or something like that to sort of help me make that transition. Do you have any advice for people in other ways that they can help sort of make that transition from one self to another if they're having a particularly hard time, or is it just awareness? You think that's enough?
Well, at the risk of making, it's very hard when you say to someone, um, can you tell us something that's in your book? And the answer on this one is we have a list of about 50 different ways of breaking the triggering, which is the negative, into a bad self, and making that shifting, so that you do it consciously and with full awareness. Now that includes going into a self that you normally would be uncomfortable with. And I'm just thinking of a time when I was asked to be in a hard negotiation with someone, and he had been the former president of the National Rifle Association. And I'm one of these people that does not like or feel comfortable around guns in any way. But I had to shift into a self that he would respect so we could do the negotiation. And I was able to do that. And that simply, in that case, the situation demanded it. And often a situation demands courage. Sometimes it demands amazing strength. You know, we have all these pictures of women who pick up the back of a car and get their child out from under it. And when then the tabloid comes and says, could you do that so we get a picture of it? And she says, are you crazy? I'm a 154-pound woman. I can't pick up the back of that car, except if my child is under it. So we have ways of shifting, and there are a lot of them. Taking a deep breath, listen to music, walking in, thinking of positive thought, an affirmation. Unfortunately, it is a full page list. So, and when you read it, you will see that you do a lot of those, but you hadn't done them quite as consciously as you will by understanding this.
I'm curious, with your past work with psychedelics, and then now this book, is there, do those go together in any ways? Do psychedelics, either in macro or micro doses, make this easier to see these selves or switch?
Well, what we're finding is, and there's a new word in the psychedelic therapy world, which is called integration, which is after you have had a transcendent experience or a major ego dissolving experience, in a sense, all your selves are floating a little more loosely. And how you put them back together, how you reassemble yourself for better, it's helpful if you understand that these selves exist and that they are all hoping for more harmony, to help each other. So that's one of the major areas to understand, is integration. With microdosing, it simply looks like it's easier to be into what we're calling mental health. And what we say in the book is mental health is being in the right mind at the right time. And when you were giving your different roles, they're all right. You know, if you're being a CEO when you're with your company, that's the correct behavior, even though it may be, say, much more autocratic than when you're a father with your children, but that's correct for the time. So the right mind at the right time doesn't mean that you're a beautiful, enlightened, sweet, nice person all the time, because that's not correct all the time.
So here's an answer that's in the book, but since some people haven't read it yet, and I know a lot of people are talking about it, how is this different than multiple personality disorders?
Okay, multiple personality. See, the word is very clear. Multiple personality disorder. That says this is a disorder of multiple personalities, which obviously means there's also an order in multiple personalities, because that's who we all are. The technical term for the mental illness is called disassociation, which is the selves literally are not communicating well. In fact, they may not even share memory. Some of you may not want to admit to this, but you may have had a time in your life when you woke up and you thought, how did I get here? In fact, where am I? And sometimes you roll it to one side or the other and you're saying, who am I with? Okay, that's disassociation, which is you don't have memory of what happened, but you somehow you drove someplace, you parked someplace, and so forth. So that's disassociation, and it is a correctly determined mental illness. Association is what we are aiming for. And so what we found is very successful people, particularly people who are good in 3 or 4 different fields, have an intuitive grasp of how to use which self at which time. And we discussed Herschel Walker, this amazing, most valuable football player. He has danced in a ballet, he's run companies, he's done a whole lot of other activities. And what he says, in one lovely quote, he says, you don't want Herschel Walker, the football player, to be your babysitter. You want another person. And so that's the dance that we're in. And that's what the book also does is has examples from sports, from music, from poetry, from psychology, from neuroscience, from philosophy, from religions, because if, as we know, people have selves, it should appear pretty much all over the culture, and it does.
How does this relate to, if it does, to internal family systems?
Family systems. I actually looked it up the other day. I think we have 5 references. Internal family systems basically says inside of you, there's a bunch of selves. And the reason that you're in therapy, because that's a therapeutic system, is something isn't working. Somebody's not behaving well. Somebody is always eating, for instance, someone is always eating too much cheesecake, and all of the selves are getting heavy and getting diabetic, for example. Okay, so internal family systems is one, and we think we have about 8 others, therapeutic systems which clarify in different ways and with different names and different theories these selves. And each of these therapeutic systems has a different way of moving back towards harmony. And internal family systems is, we think, very sophisticated. And actually, their last book came out after we'd almost finished our manuscript. And there's a couple of quotes that we've taken from them because their understanding of the dynamics of dysfunctional selves is what it's about. Our book actually is not about mental illness at all. It's about everybody else.
This is for the average person looking to perform better in life and transition from situation to situation just more smoothly, right?
More smoothly. It's also answering the question is, who am I? Okay. And the answer is, I am, and Walt Whitman says, I contain multitudes. And once you realize that you contain different selves, your life, it's quite remarkable. You are kinder to other people, partly because many of us have a family member, Uncle Abner, 15 years ago, cheated your father in a real estate deal. And we've never spoken to him since. And then you think, gee, we all loved him. He was really fun. He was a lovely guy. But everyone says, well, that's the way it is, because Uncle Abner is really this bad person. And the answer is Uncle Abner may have, done this nefarious deed, but the rest of him is still the same person you always knew. So you become able to forgive and understand other people. And eventually you begin to notice you could forgive and understand yourself better. And that's a deeper relief. So people become nicer and more compassionate, which is fairly remarkable for a paperback book.
I think Uncle Abner is kind of an a-hole in general, but I get your point. I have a question specifically about therapies, people who are practicing therapy and trying to help. If they read this book and they do want to go that extra step, do you think that the IFS training is a good place for someone to go to get more training and how to apply this to patients?
Well, it's always tempting when you write a book to turn it into another set of businesses. But if you're really trying to write a book so that people don't need additional training, see, the nice thing is this isn't a discovery. Plato describes this quite beautifully, and we quote him. So it's been around. What I will tell you about one of the therapists I know who read the book fairly early on, he said, I now just say to my clients, read this book and then we'll start therapy. And I said to him, why do you do that? He says, so it'll take less time and it'll be faster, because the goal of therapy is not to squash everybody into what we call a single self assumption, which doesn't make sense, but to give people the chance to understand their selves. And also the internal dynamics become sometimes very moving. In one of the psychedelic studies with MMDA, I watched a man, a vet with post-traumatic stress disorder, talk about a part of himself that he hated, that was suicidal and angry and so forth. And as the therapy goes on through the hours, he becomes more aware of that this very disturbed part has its own issues, that he begins to understand them. He begins to dialogue with himself. He begins to forgive himself, and it just makes me cry almost to think about it. He understands that he can befriend this part of himself, can help it, so it no longer wants either to overdose on drugs or on alcohol or consider suicide. And so what you see is, as people recognize selves, harmony is more likely. And so the goal of therapy, it kind of makes all therapy into family therapy, which is the internal family, like the IFS, the internal family. I mean, we admire, when we go visit, we admire a family where everyone clearly wants everyone else to succeed. And that's what we want for ourselves. And that's what simply, and there are chapters in this book of small exercises or ideas, or several chapters of a kind of how-to. So that if I were to say, read the book, and before you want special training, see if you can read the last few chapters and see if there's enough tools already there for you. It's kind of like when I buy a power tool, I could also buy a 500-page manual, but most of the time the tool really explains itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Obviously the people with PTSD may require some assistance like MDMA, but I think all of us, even without PTSD, could benefit from a better understanding of ourselves and a little bit more empathy for the different parts of ourselves and all of our successes and all of our failures.
And also the parts of us that are traumatized very often seem to be stuck at being childish. I don't know if you've ever been in a relationship where someone said to you, "You're behaving like a 5-year-old," and you immediately go, "No, I'm not behaving like a 5-year-old." And
Exactly like that.
They don't say anything. But the 5-year-old in you, if that's there, can be worked with and helped. And I remember many years ago a young woman who was having difficulty in a relationship with a boyfriend. It was wonderful until lovemaking came up, and then she would freeze. And what she realized is her 5-year-old had been sexually abused. And what she found is, if she went to bed with, and this is, I know it sounds as silly, if it didn't work, I wouldn't tell you, with a little stuffed animal. And if she went to bed with a little stuffed animal and kind of talked to her 5-year-old, so the 5-year-old had a stuffed animal to hold, she could then be with her boyfriend, and the relationship actually was pretty good. So there are things we do that maybe seem unusual, but not if you're thinking family dynamics. If you think of, here's say a single mom with a 5-year-old and a boyfriend, the story I just told you, makes total sense.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
that.
we are both of those people inside of one.
That's a bit of that integration that you were speaking to earlier about bringing sort of the other self back into your life. Now, Matt and I were just talking about this recently, about a story that I recently read about sort of bringing the child back into your life now. So it seems like there's really something there, and it seems to be working for a lot of people.
Well, it's wonderful when you have a book that helps people and they don't have to do anything. It's a real gift. And as I say, I'm hoping not to turn it into another profession.
Well, Dr. Fadiman, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a great conversation. If anyone out there is interested in learning more, the book is The Symphony of Selves. Is that right?
Your
Your
Symphony.
Symphony of Selves, pardon me. And then, of course, if you're more interested in the macrodosing or the microdosing, or maybe both, that book is the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. So you can find both of those.
More on my website, jamesfadiman.com, because the book was written 10 years ago, and we were just the first instant of microdosing is in the book, and it's still good, but there's a lot more information now.
jamesfadiman.com if you're interested in learning even more than what's already in the book. Thank you, Dr. Fadiman.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much.
Matt, this was great. Okay.
Thanks for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you found it helpful, give us a 5-star rating and write a review on iTunes. It really helps the podcast, and we greatly appreciate it. If you want to be a client or you want to work with us, go to wildhealth.com. Thanks again.